All right, I had this great question from somebody on Twitter asking me about what I thought about Dr. Walter Longo's recommendations on protein for longevity. And he basically says zero point 0.4 grams per kilogram, mostly coming from plant sources for protein, which is very low. I mean, it's extremely low. That is half of what the RDA is. And in my view, the RDA is already very low. And most of this, and Walter Longo is regarded widely as a very prolific researcher. He's been credited for a lot of things out there. But I think in this particular situation, there's a lot that would sort of argue against that supposition. Certainly, if your goal, if your destination is frailty, then that would be the prescription for that. If you look at, for instance, the dietary macronutrient composition of a country like India, it is very similar to this. This is what we're seeing, mostly plant-based, very low protein. And what do we see in India? Obviously there's other confounders like poverty and things like that, but certainly we see shortened life expectancy. We see massive amounts of sarcopenia, frailty, the so-called TOFI phenotype, thin on the outside, fat on the inside, a lot of little pot-bellied guys, and enormous rates of diabetes, heart disease, and so on and so forth. But where do these recommendations really come from? Well, they come from mostly a lot of animal studies, particularly lower animals, mice studies, for instance. You can look at fruit fly studies and sort of these little worm-like things called nematode studies. That's where most of the data comes from. There's very little data on higher animals and particularly humans in particular. There's one study that Longo cites, and this was published a few years ago, showing that high protein in middle age was associated with shortened life outcomes, whereas higher protein in longer ages was associated with a little better outcome. And that paper, the conclusions that were reached on that were so preposterous that it prompted some of the top protein research in the world, namely guys like Stu Phillips, Don Layman's, and others, to construct a very pointed letter to the editor of the journal it was published in. Now, the journal did not publish their criticism because Walter Longo sits on the editorial board and probably had something to do with that. But here is, the findings from that letter, and they basically say this is one of the most ridiculously poorly done studies that they've ever come across. And these are guys that are really heavyweights in the world of protein metabolism, muscle, and so on and so forth. And just on the other side of the spectrum, so how much do we need? Here's former Mr. Olympia Jay Cutler talking about his dietary and protein intake.
Eggs, and I would buy 30 dozen eggs at a time from a local farm stand. Some of my diets, I'm not going to lie, I was eating over 100 eggs a day. You laugh at that, but I would buy a whole cow at a time. I had a local butcher. I'd walk in the butcher shop and my cow would be hanging, and I'd say, this is hamburg, this is steaks, and I would buy a whole cow, and then they'd have 140 pounds of chicken at a time. So I had 2 freezers in my garage, and I would eat 5 pounds of meat a day, plus the eggs. I drank 2 cups of egg whites. I blend it in a blender with ice and a little bit of my amino acids.
Now, obviously, I would argue that most people don't need to consume that level of protein either. That's certainly, I guess if you want to be Mr. Olympia, perhaps you do. Particularly, you have to realize there's a lot of drugs involved in that. Now, I certainly have had my experiments with that. Currently, I consume quite a bit of protein. I probably consume average something like 300 grams of protein a day, sometimes as much as 400 and 500 grams from time to time. And I have done the low protein experiment. I did that a few years ago, back in, I think it was 2020. And what did it do for me? Well, initially just overall less food. I got leaner and leaner, but eventually I lost a lot of muscle. I got down all the way down, like for instance, right now I'm about 265 pounds. Remember, I'm 6'5", so I'm a pretty big guy. I'm not, I would no one would say I'm like overly bulky or anything like that, or maybe a few would, but I was, I can remember my family was saying, we thought you were really sick. We thought something was wrong with you. We thought, kind of looked like a cancer patient. I remember my dad and my sister, when I came to visit them over Thanksgiving one year, they thought I was like, what the hell is wrong with you, boy? They'd never seen me that way. So that's what low protein does in many cases. If your goal is to be, very thin, very week, quite honestly, then go for it. Now, longevity, who really knows? I mean, one of the criticisms around like mouse studies is that chronically mice are overfed in captivity. And so when you just cut them calorically, they're going to live longer just because they're not overfed anymore. The same thing can be said of human data. We talk about caloric restriction, protein restriction. If a human is fat, that's the only time they benefit from these sort of caloric reduction measures in any real significant sense. I did an interview with a guy named Keith Barr at I think he's at UC Davis, I believe, several years ago, talking about this very phenomenon, mTOR signaling and all these concerns around that. And basically they came to the conclusion that if you are consuming higher protein and exercising, which I think go hand in hand, I think you should do that, then the likelihood of you, based on animal studies, achieving a long, healthy age is quite high. Conversely, if you restrict your protein and perhaps don't exercise, you may also, achieve a long lifespan, but at the cost of frailty. And it's about how do you want to age? Do you want to be the 70-year-old guy that can't carry his luggage across the airport, sitting there waiting on the wheelchair, because you can't do anything? Or do you want to be the vigorous, robust person that at 70 is still out there climbing mountains and, playing with their grandkids? So anyway, I know where I want to be. I know where I want to fall on that side of the equation. So anyway, I think, certainly the recommendations on protein consumption, I think Don Layman, Stu Phillips and those guys, 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram. I think that serves a purpose for most people. I think if you're trying to actively put on muscle, then even a little more than that might be helpful. And you guys saw the recent study talking about, we now know, or at least new studies seem to indicate, that there is no upper limit on how much protein you consume in one meal. Remember, the old thing was, you can only utilize 30 grams for muscle protein synthesis. New studies have shown that largely to be kind of not accurate, that you can consume at least up to 100 grams and probably more without any limitations on what can go to muscle protein synthesis and what you can absorb, which would be consistent with, what our likely human evolutionary past would be. It's very unlikely that cavemen were walking around with little 30-gram Tupperware, containers eating protein every 3 to 4 hours. I think that was likely improbable. So I think we are a species that clearly, feasted when we had opportunity to eat food, and then we went longer periods of time without eating. It just would not be convenient. You think about if you did not have the modern conveniences, a stove, a kitchen, cookware, all the things that make consumption of food so much easier now, and you had to start a fire and you do all that stuff, you would probably eat less frequently. All right, guys, let me know what you think about that. What is your protein preferences, guys? And what do you think about this 0.4 grams recommendation that Walter Longo put out there? Has any of you guys tried that? And let me know what the results were. All right, we will talk to you soon. Take care, guys.